Come on, Tiffany. Dr. Crutcher?
How you think that that brother getting his sentence overturned over in Minnesota, does that impact Chauvin in any way?
Yeah.
The black police officer?
Yeah, if he doesn't plea to the federal charges, but he's going to plea to the federal charges. But the feds, I think, they got him.
Yeah, they got it.
Yeah, and so that's what's the difference. Huh? Okay.
Oh, that's newsy. The case in Colorado with the young man, I'm thinking they're going to get 30 million, 30.
They should, but Colorado is conservative place.
Man, Colorado, my boy Spencer's up there, man. They way more progressive.
Oh, they are?
Absolutely. They just gave $3 million for this woman that got an arm broken. And they don't have qualified immunity within the state.
Colorado didn't have no black.
It's a small amount, but it's a very progressive place.
Well, that'd be good. That'd be real good. Okay.
Doc, you ready?
Dr. Crutcher, we gotta go.
Just behind. The mic's are loud.
We got somebody coming up here. Are they with us? Is she with you? Okay. Okay, thanks.
Okay, good. Nicole?
Where's Tiffany? Tiffany.
Tiffany up here?
Is everyone ready? And we'll try to keep our voices up. And okay. And everybody will try to speak loud. Good morning. I'm Attorney Ben Crump, along with my great Oklahoma co-counsel and Omega brother. We have the honor of representing the family of Terence Crutcher. His twin sister, Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, is present with us today. Also, I have my law partner, Chris O'Neill, present with us, as well as Nicole Austin Hillary of the Human Rights Watch is present with us. Also, Sherilyn Eiffel, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and Praneet Chima is going to be here speaking on behalf of LDF. We also have a representative of Sheila Jackson Lee, Congresswoman from Houston, Texas, present with us today. We have her communications director, Jalila Ahmed. We also have present with us, standing with the family, Mr. Joe Briggs and Mr. George Atala of the National Football League Players Association. And we're grateful to many of the NFL players for lending their support to these families that are fighting against these unjustifiable killings at the hands of police excessive force. 5 years ago today, Terence Crutcher was walking away from the police attorney Solomon Simmons with his hands up. His back was to police officer Betty Shelby. And it is inexplicable from that day to this one why she shot this unarmed black man who was simply having car trouble. He had committed no crime. But as often is the case that we see far too many times in America, police shoot first and ask questions later when it's unarmed black people. And from that day to this one, his twin sister, Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, has bared her heart, saying that her brother's life matters. And that's why she's been here to Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill on many occasions with the families of George Floyd and Botham Jean and Breonna Taylor and so many other families that have had their loved ones taken far too soon at the hands of the people who are supposed to protect and serve them. And just yesterday, on the eve of the 5-year anniversary, Dr. Crutcher and attorney Solomon Simmons and others were on Capitol Hill, and they were trying to get support for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act so we will have meaningful police reform, because her brother's blood is on that legislation, and it is evidenced by that video. And while she was on Capitol Hill, she approached Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, and she's going to tell you about that fateful meeting and how we pray that that will help get this bill on the floor of the United States Senate once and for all. And if that happens, we have her to thank for her tenacity and her conviction and her pain being turned into purpose, while we're finally going to have this bill come before the United States Senate. And you're going to hear from my stalwart co-counsel, Demario Solomon Simmons, and he's going to talk about why they are here urging the United States Department of Justice to reopen the investigation into the unjustified killing of Terence Crutcher. And then after you hear from attorney Solomon Simmons, we will introduce you to the person who is the voice of Terence Crutcher. These many years later, still crying out from the wilderness that we're better than this, America. So now you will hear from attorney Demario Solomon Simmons.
Thank you, Ben. I'm attorney Demario Solomon Simmons. Law is my ministry. Justice is my passion. For the last 5 years, I had the great pleasure and honor to work alongside and represent the family of Terence Crutcher, including my sister and my friend, Dr. Tiffany Crutcher. We have asked specifically and formally in a letter to the Department of Justice to reopen the criminal investigation into the murder of Terence Crutcher that happened 5 years ago today, along with LDF and Human Rights Watch and many other leaders, national and local leaders. Why are we doing this today? Why are we making this announcement 5 years later? Because we do not trust the investigation from the previous administration. We cannot trust that they actually looked at this case for what it is, an unarmed black man shot with his hands up in the air. We asking the Joe Biden administration, the President Biden's administration, the current administration, to reopen this case, to do a proper investigation, because we believe strongly that the evidence is clear. The video is clear. Yes. Terence Crutcher's civil rights were violated when he was shot with his hands up in the air, and when they allowed him to lay on the ground for over 2.5 minutes without any medical assistance. When on video, the officers made eyewitnesses leave the scene, never to be investigated, never to be discussed about what they saw and heard. That is on video. Until this very day, not one officer has been disciplined. Not one person who participated in the cover-up of the murder of Terrence has been brought to justice. And that is why we're asking for this administration, an administration that is built upon racial equity and civil rights, to reopen this investigation and to open a civil practice and patterns investigation into the Tulsa Police Department. It is beyond time for the Tulsa Police Department to be investigated, not only for the murder and the cover-up of Terence Crutcher, but for the continual degradation of black and brown people's civil rights in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That is why we're here today. Because as Tiffany always has said, Dr. Crutcher, Terrence's life mattered. And his death will not be in vain. And yes, I want Tiffany, she's going to talk about the pain that her family has had and how they've turned their pain into purpose, including yesterday, seeing Joe Manchin and asking him to commit to supporting her family by supporting the George Floyd Policing Act. That is the commitment we need from Senator Manchin and every politician who says they are for racial equity, for civil rights, and for just doing what is right for our country to move into the next half of the 21st century as a place where freedom, justice, and equality actually occurs for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Solomon Simmons. And now you will hear from Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, the twin sister of Terence Crutcher and the co-founder of Sisters of the Movement. She will talk with you about why she bared her heart on Capitol Hill, why she bared her heart with Senator Joe Manchin, and why she is bearing her heart with the Department of Justice. Because you understand, her and Terrence were in the womb together. There's no tighter bond than you can have than to have a twin sibling. And to have that sibling shot down like a dog in the street when he got his hands up. I mean, hands up in the air. This is after Michael Brown and Ferguson. And we all started saying, hands up, don't shoot. Well, this was hands up, don't shoot on video. And yet, the police officer still had no consequences. So at this time, please give your attention to Dr. Tiffany Crutcher.
Thank you, Attorney Crump, and thank you to everyone for being here today and for all who stood with my family for the last 5 years. This day never gets easier. 5 years later, it is still very difficult to know that my twin brother isn't here. It was 5 years ago today that my twin brother Terrence was murdered at the hands of a Tulsa police officer who had a history of violence, anger, and poor judgment. My brother was on the way home from school at our local community college. He was driving back to see his young children, to do a gospel music workshop with my parents at church. His car stalled in the middle of the road and he needed help. He needed a competent, rational, well-trained public servant to aid him in a difficult situation. But Officer Betty Shelby was none of those things. Rather than uphold her oath and discharge her duty to protect and serve, she decided to discharge her weapon. She shot my brother, an unarmed black father, with his hands in the air, in cold blood. And then she retreated to her car instead of rendering aid. In 5 years, my family has received no justice. And so today, on the day when I should be with my family, I am here 1,000 miles away fighting for justice for my twin brother. Amen. I'm standing here to call on the nation's Department of Justice to reopen the case in my brother's killing, into Officer Shelby's actions, and into a culture of relentless racial bias that has permeated Tulsa's police department for generations. It is my hope that President Biden's administration will go beyond the empty talk of racial justice we saw over the last 4 years and instead vigorously act to ensure that justice is done. In this same breath, I'm also calling on the leaders of Congress to swiftly advance the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Just last night, I ran into Senator Joe Manchin, and I pressed him on the issue of this policing act. I asked him unequivocally, where do you stand? Do you support the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act? And he said, absolutely. And he shared with me that he would be meeting with Tim Scott next week to get an update. He said that something needs to be done. And so I am counting on Senator Manchin and his leadership to make sure that something gets done. We don't need another George Floyd. We don't need another Botham Jean. We don't need another Breonna Taylor. We don't need another Terence Crutcher. We need this policing act to get across the finish line. And his leadership can help get this on the Senate floor. So I will be following up with Senator Manchin on next week, along with so many other families. It is beyond time to enact sweeping reforms in our system of law enforcement, including ending qualified immunity. And let me be clear to those with an agenda against racial justice who will seek to twist my words. I have friends and family members who put on a uniform each day to protect and serve their communities. This message is not anti-police. This message is anti-corruption, it's anti-racism, and it's anti-violence. This message is about ensuring that bad police who harm our communities, like the officer who killed my brother, are held accountable, are forced to hand in their badge, hand in their gun, and are taken off our streets for good. Anyone who opposes accountability also stands in opposition to our good officers, in opposition to black and brown communities, and in opposition to justice itself. 5 years ago, my brother was taken from me. My parents lost their son. My nieces and nephew lost their father. And before Terrence died, he told me something that I will never forget. He said, Tiffany, God is going to get the glory out of my life. And with everything in me, I know that that is true. And so I ask all of you to stand with us, to stand with me, to stand with my family, and with families across this nation who have lost those they love to violence at the hands of law enforcement. In the words of Ella Baker, I end with, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until justice comes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crutcher, for once again bearing your heart. We have just a few more speakers before we take your questions. At this time, we're going to hear from Puneet Shima from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
I bring apologies from Charlene Eiffel that she couldn't be here in person, and I'll be reading her remarks. I regret that I cannot be with you today to stand with the Crutcher family in their ongoing and relentless fight for justice and accountability for the killing of their brother and son, Terrence. Unfortunately, I was unable to travel to Washington, D.C., but I've asked Puneet Shima, the manager of LDF's Justice and Public Safety Project, to present these remarks on my behalf. 5 years ago, on this day, the killing of Terence Crutcher on the side of a road during a routine traffic encounter shone a bright and painful light on the reality of police violence for black people in this country. Mr. Crutcher presented no threat. but an officer in a helicopter that was close enough to see Mr. Crutcher's skin color thought he looked like a, quote, bad dude, end quote. It did not matter that he was unarmed or that his hands were raised in the air, that he did not threaten Tulsa police officer Betty Shelby and was simply stopped on a road. She did not see Terence Crutcher's full humanity, the lives of his family that would be forever altered when she took his life, his children, his parents, his twin sister, Dr. Tiffany Crutcher. Betty Shelby could not see the wide and deep impact that her killing of Terence Crutcher would have on his community and this country. 5 years later, the Crutcher family and this country are still waiting for justice. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division began a criminal investigation into then Officer Shelby's actions in 2016. In 2019, the department, then under the leadership of a Trump administration that made clear its hostility to holding law enforcement accountable, decided it would not file charges. I had the privilege of meeting the Crutcher family several years ago at the annual dinner of the Terence Crutcher Foundation. I was overwhelmed with the integrity, grace, clarity, and determination of this family to keep Terence's memory alive, to obtain accountability for his death, and to help make the kinds of changes that would ensure that no family would endure the agony they endured when Terence was killed and no one was held accountable. It has been my honor to learn from the Crutcher family and to support their effort to help advance real change in law enforcement practices in Tulsa and across the country. Dr. Tiffany Crutcher in particular has been relentless, fearless, and unstoppable in this week. She speaks truth to power, whether it is to the mayor of Tulsa, to members of Congress, to the president or vice president of this country. Already this year, the Biden administration's Department of Justice has demonstrated a renewed willingness to fulfill its obligations and hold law enforcement officers accountable when they violate the law. We are gratified by these changes, but we come together today to call on the department to reconsider its prior criminal investigation in the death of Mr. Crutcher. It is absolutely necessary to ensure that the investigation was thorough, complete, and unbiased. The Department of Justice has a sacred responsibility to protect the fundamental rights of all people in this country. When law enforcement officers violate people's constitutional rights, they tear at the fabric of our democracy. To prevent this erosion, the department must hold officers accountable when they act unlawfully. We've seen over the last year that police killings of innocent black people have put our democracy in a precarious state. Hundreds of thousands of Americans in all 50 states took to the streets just a year ago to peacefully protest against police violence and racism, outraged by the never-ending taking of innocent black lives, with a demand for change, for accountability. This department must ensure that it uses all of the tools available to it to provide that accountability. It is the honor and privilege of the staff at LDF to stand with the Crutcher family in its demand that justice finally be served for the actions of Officer Shelby. The Crutcher family, the city of Tulsa, and the country deserve nothing less. Sincerely, Cheryl Eiffel.
Thank you. And now we will have brief remarks by Nicole Austin Hillary of the Human Rights Watch.
Thank you so much. Human Rights Watch knew that when Terence Crutcher was murdered 5 years ago today, that something was amiss in Tulsa. And so we sent a researcher to be on the ground because we wanted to find out what kind of jurisdiction is this where a black man in distress with his hands in the air can find himself at the other end of a police officer's gun and dead at the end of the day. We knew there was a problem and that something needed to be done. And we went to Tulsa and we started meeting with Dr. Tiffany Crutcher and her amazing family. And we met with the police in Tulsa. And we met with community members and church leaders. And that resulted in a research report in which we laid out that there was indeed a problem in Tulsa, that there was a problem with policing, but not just with policing, but a problem with the way in which the black community is disrespected and disregarded. The death of Terence Crutcher is a manifestation of that disrespect. Human Rights Watch has stayed on the ground in Tulsa. Once we got there, we didn't leave. We have been behind Dr. Tiffany Crutcher and the Crutcher Foundation from that point forward. And that's what brings me here today. Everyone needs to understand this very clearly. The death of a black man in the United States at the hands of a police officer is not just a civil rights issue, it is a human rights issue. Human rights and civil rights are inextricably linked. And if we in this country and in this democracy don't understand that, we will never get full justice. Human Rights Watch stands behind Dr. Tiffany Crutcher and the Crutcher Foundation in asking the Department of Justice to reopen the investigation into her brother Terrence's murder. We pushed for and assumed like so many, that the local jurisdiction would do its job, but it didn't. And when the local jurisdiction doesn't do what it's supposed to do, it is the responsibility of our Department of Justice to do just that. The right to be free from discrimination and to live free of discrimination is a human right. The right not to be killed, the right to live freely and equally is a human right. So we stand with the Crutcher family today to ask the Department of Justice very clearly and very simply to do your job and ensure the protection of civil rights and human rights for brother Terence Crutcher and for all the black men and women whose lives have been lost, and to those lives that we seek to protect, because that is what democracy looks like and that's what democracy stands for. Thank you.
And then final remarks will come from Jalea Ahmed, who is the Communications Director for Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee out of Houston, Texas, and then we will take your questions.
Thank you. It's both an honor and a privilege to stand by Dr. Tiffany Crutcher this morning on this 5th anniversary of the killing of your twin brother, Mr. Terence Crutcher. I'm here on behalf of Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who couldn't be here physically because she's back in her district due to Hurricane Nicholas. But Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee is the chair of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. She introduced H.R. 1570, the George Floyd Law Enforcement Justice and Integrity Act, and stands with Dr. Tiffany Crutcher and your family. Congresswoman Jackson Lee is on the phone. Everyone, the Honorable Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm honored to be able to be here, albeit in voice and not in person, very briefly, with this mountainous group of leaders. Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, without ceasing, her wonderful family, a father, a veteran that I met and saw his pain. Ben Crump, of course, that has been on the battlefield, along with Demario Solomon Simmons, and, of course, the representative of Sherilyn Eiffel and Nicole Austin Hillary, and others that stand with us today. My purpose for joining you today is I wanted my voice to be heard as a representative of many in the United States Congress. The shooting, the video was very difficult to watch. Not my words, but the words of then Chief of Police Chuck Jordan, who called for a federal investigation. And obviously the brutal death of Terence Crutcher, a gospel-loving man, a man who could sing, a father loved by his Tulsa community, loved by his twin sister. It was without a doubt that an investigation should take place. Why was a helicopter flying over? Why was it the husband of Officer Shelby? Why did he lay in a pool of blood? Why was he not attended to? Why was his hands up, but he was still shot? And then why did Tulsa, Oklahoma Police Department have 24 shootings between 2007 and 2016? Why didn't the Trump Justice Department have the decency to see the brutal death of this loving man to be one that resulted or needed a full civil rights investigation. We don't have those answers. But today I join all of you by sending a letter to the Department of Justice asking for that investigation to start immediately, asking Attorney General Garth to start that investigation and to note that it is long overdue. I know that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, in the name of all those who have called, from Eric Garner to Breonna Taylor to George Floyd, Deontay Wright, and others, and Tamir Rice, is long overdue. But I insist that we are not finished. And so in addition to a call for the investigation, the civil rights investigation, there should be a full investigation of the Tulsa Police Department and the issuance of a consent decree in that department, if it has not already been done. Again, this was a terrible video to watch, but it was a terrible loss of life. And I stand here today pleading and asking and demanding that an investigation be reopened, and that we find truth and justice for the Crutcher family. I stand with you, Dr. Tiffany Crutcher. I stand with you, and I will never leave your side. We will secure a victory. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Jackson Lee. And before we open it up for questions and answers, I would like to acknowledge two of the Terence Crutcher Foundation board members who are here today, Mrs. Tabitha Temple and Mrs. Adina Ellis, who's right behind me. So thank you all so much for being here.
And again, Tiffany, thank you for your conviction and bearing your heart to not only Tulsa, but to America here on Capitol Hill. And with that, we'll take your questions. Yes, ma'am. Dr. Crutcher.
The impact is still pretty difficult. I mean, you have children. Just on today, Terrence's daughter, Tajane, went to get her driver's license. Terrence will not be here for that milestone, and she's sad about that. Terrence Jr. will turn 10 next year. That's a milestone. My mother, we lost her to COVID-19 just this year, a mother of the movement who was at City Hall week in and week out, never to see justice for her son because of doctrines like qualified immunity. We've had no closure whatsoever. Not one policy reform has happened in Tulsa that would prevent what happened to Terrence from happening to someone else. And so it's exhausting to have to get up every single day to fight for your loved one. It is. And so there's definitely been a negative impact, but because of our community of angels in Tulsa, our family, our friends, the people who are standing here with us today, it helps us get through another day, and I'm so grateful. Absolutely. Terrence Jr., real situation. We were leaving the movies, and the police pulled us over, and Terrence started screaming to the top of his lungs, thinking that he was going to get shot and killed. And the police officer just pulled me over and said my headlights needed to come on. How do we fix that? How do we fix that fear of little kids being afraid of the people who are supposed to protect and serve? And so, Terrence is in counseling every 2 weeks, and we're trying to work through those issues of trauma.
Let's go from Nicole, if we can. And I'll say this, as Attorney Solomon Simmons and I have observed in years past, every birthday that Dr. Crutcher celebrates for the rest of her life is a painful reminder that the person who came into this world with her was unjustly taken from this world. Let that sink in. Nicole?
Yes, we sent the letter in from my office, and we have had contact with the DOJ. We do believe that we'll have a meeting with them very soon. We're waiting on that and be able to talk to them about making this happen. We think this is a very reasonable request. As Nicole stated from Human Rights Watch and also LDF, they've been in Tulsa for the last 3 or 4 years. They've done the research. They produced the reports. They've shown the bias in policing, bias in investigations. They've shown why this is necessary. So we feel very strong that the Department of Justice will meet with us, hopefully very soon, hopefully maybe even today before we leave Washington, D.C., and that this is something that will happen.
Yes, so after 5 years to build justice for Terrence, do you believe the mayor and police chief new internal advisory boards will solve the systemic issue?
No, we do not believe that the police should be investigating themselves. That's one of the most frustrating aspects of this 5-year anniversary, that there hasn't been any changes to the police department in Tulsa. There's no oversight, no independent oversight. They're still monitoring themselves. They haven't changed any policies and procedures that allow Betty Shelby to murder Terrence and then get away with it. In fact, it was the city of Tulsa that allowed their own police officers to attend trainings that Betty Shelby was giving after the shooting, basically able to talk about how to deal with shooting someone and how to get away with it. This is the reality of Tulsa. This is what we want to make sure the Department of Justice comes in and does a proper investigation. I think it's also very important to understand that the Crutcher family, Dr. Crutcher and Terrence, they were descendants of those who were impacted and were victims of the Tulsa massacre 100 years ago. And that was another piece of police violence. In fact, I would argue it was the largest police violence that ever occurred in this country in the 20th century. And so the same city that had state violence that terrorized their great-grandmother, Rebecca Brown Crutcher, killed Terence Crutcher 5 years ago, and 5 years to this date, there has been no justice for the massacre. There's been no justice for the Crutcher family. No.
I know you recently put in a request to the DOJ to investigate the mass graves and how they were being handled. Is there any update on that as well, how that may be going?
Yes, again, as I said, we've heard from the Department of Justice. They have received both letters. They are interested in talking about the mass graves, and that is something we hope to have a meeting in the next couple of weeks. We think it's all intertwined. It's all together. And we're begging, we're asking and pleading for the DOJ to come in, because we've never had a proper federal investigation of the massacre. We've never had a proper federal investigation of the shooting of Terrence, and it's intertwined. So we hope to have those meetings very, very soon.
Any other questions? Okay. If there are no questions, we'll update you on Dr. Crutcher's follow-up with Senator Joe Manchin.
Thank you.